Alaskans, wherever you are, welcome to the Must Read Alaska Show. Coming to you from somewhere in Alaska. This is the place where we talk about, you guessed it, Alaska. Where we keep the mainstream media on their toes and where we are standing up for what's right in a world run by leftists. You can find out more by heading over to mustreadalaska.com and also checking out the Must Read Alaska YouTube channel for some really great content. But first, let's get this party started.
Welcome, everybody, to the Must Read Alaska Show. I'm your host, John Quick, coming to you live from somewhere in Alaska. I hope everybody's having a phenomenal week so far. If you want to support Must Read Alaska, just go to mustreadalaska.com. On the right-hand side, there's a little donate button. Every $5, $10, $100 helps keep the lights on here at Must Read Alaska. If you want to sponsor the Must Read Alaska Show, just email me, John, John, at mustreadalaska.com. Would love to have you sponsor the show. Today, we have a very special guest today, an author, folks. Rodger Carlyle, who's authored many, many books. We're going to get all into that. But first, Rodger, welcome to the Must Read Alaska Show.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and your followers.
Well, this will be fun. You have authored several books, which we'll kind of talk a little bit more about down the road. But first, I'd love to hear the story of what got you into writing in the first place.
First of all, it can be a very long story, but I'll keep it as short as I can. I've written my whole life. For a long period of time, I did ghostwriting for campaign managers in politics. And about 15 years ago, my wife walked in after a particularly frustrating session with a campaign manager, and she said, "You know, you write all fiction anyway. Why don't you go write your own?" So I made a transition from writing on contract into writing fiction. And so I've been serious about writing fiction for about 15 years. For 4 or 5 of those years, I worked with an agent, and about probably 7 years ago, got very serious about self-publishing, which is really now the dominant publishing form for authors all over the country. So I've been at it very seriously for 7 years. My background is economics and political science. I've traveled the whole world. I've had offices literally from Amsterdam to Khabarovsk, in Moscow to Mexico City. So I have a lot of international experience. And that in the political consulting I did gave me a really good background for writing.
That's awesome. So you've written several books. Tell me about maybe one of your favorite books that you've written and maybe a story or so from that book and some background on it.
Okay. Well, I write in 2 different genres. I write what a lot of people call historical fiction. I call it historical adventure. And in those books, I like to find a snippet of history that just doesn't quite make sense out of the history books, do a bunch of research, and then write a fictional story that might tell a more accurate story of what's really going on. And a lot of that, those snippets I found not only in the United States, but in archives and museums and libraries all over the world. And one that I found about 20 years ago was in Mexico. And it talked about how Abraham Lincoln, during the same time he was fighting the American Civil War, was up to his ass in the Mexican Civil War going on between Maximilian and Benito Juarez in Mexico. And how one of the things that he would do is he kept putting his thumb on the scale, eventually to the point where he had to finish that. So as the South was defeated in the American Civil War, Lincoln ordered all of the arms from the Southern armories gathered up and carried across the border into Mexico. And those arms allowed Benito Juarez to dominate the last year of Civil War, way more bloody than ours. So I wrote a historical fiction called 2 Civil Wars, and it talks about how the American Civil War, certain characters in the American Civil War, especially in the South, were extraordinarily bitter at the end of the war over the outcome. And their meddling and Lincoln's meddling in Mexico, how it literally created a situation where even though the United States had been warned by one of the factions in that Mexican Civil War, if you meddle, if you don't allow this to end, you're going to have trouble on your southern border for 200 years, how that came to pass. So that is the outline behind the story. And it's interesting. It's a war story, including the end of our Civil War, includes a great deal of the conflict, descriptions of conflict in the Mexican Civil War, but it's also a love story. I find that in my personal life, the times of real conflict are also the times of greatest passion. So in each of my books, you're going to find that somebody falls in love with somebody. And of course, that makes it really work for the historical series because it's a saga that follows one family from generation to generation. So if there's no love story, there's no next generation. And perhaps my favorite part of that book is a scene that actually takes place between a Confederate ship in disguise in San Francisco Harbor and the American authorities there, and how at the end of the war, the Confederate officers, so frustrated and angry about losing the war, make up their mind that they're going to continue it elsewhere. And that's really the beginning of the story of how the Mexican part explodes. In the American Civil War, you know, most of us think we have a really good grasp of what it was. We don't. And even less, few people in this country understand that at the same time, where in the American Civil War, you know, 500,000 people were killed or wounded. In Mexico, it was 1 million with a population half the size. So the story really explains how the bitterness at the end of one civil war and one person's meddling created even more pain on the other side. The name of the book, again, is Two Civil Wars.
That's great. Well, what kind of writer's process do you go through? Because you've written several books now, you've done campaign writing before. What is your process to sit down and write a new book? You don't have to give away your secret sauce, but I think it's interesting to hear that because a lot of people think you just sit down and write it in one setting, and it's probably not like that or a lot different for most writers. What's your process like?
Well, I have, when I was doing a lot of international traveling, I had offices all over the world. And especially when I started working in the Soviet Union at the end of the collapse, during the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia thereafter, I had a process that kept me out of the bars, especially in Russia. You cannot go out and have drinks with your Russian compatriots because their task is to drink you under the table. That's considered very manly in Russia. So when I had extra time, I would spend time in the archives and the museums and the libraries just doing studies. So much of what I write about, I've got reams of notes and research going back more than a quarter century. So I just pick something out of that and then start doing some more homework. So the first thing you got to do is find something you want to write about. And for example, in one of the books, a book that I made note to you when I sent you some notes, it's called Enemy Patriots. That's a story about the Second World War and how the United States picked up almost all of the Japanese Americans and interned them during the war because they thought they were spies, and some of them were. But the real spies in the war were all on our side, and nobody's written a book about that. So that's where that book came from. So I first find the snippet, then I create the characters. The characters come even before the plot line. And then if the characters seem to fit the story, then I'll develop a plot and outline, but it's a very simple outline. It's a one-page outline, and it will simply say, here's where this begins. Here's where I want to take these characters. Here is, are the major events in the story, and here's where I want the story to end. And then once I start writing, I let the characters tell the story because they pop into your head. And once you get in character, you become those characters. And that's the outline. That's how I do it.
That's awesome. So for you, what is the, I guess, a crescendo as an author? Is it when you meet somebody maybe for the first time and they enjoyed reading your book and they're telling you all about how much they enjoyed it? What's kind of the thing that keeps you doing this week in, week out, month in, month out, year after year?
Well, First, I have to say, I've never had writer's block. I've never hit that point. I love what I do. I've spent 30 years building companies all over the world. I really like not having any employees. I really like being able to sit down at 9 o'clock after coffee and start work and work for 5 or 6 straight hours. And I try to do that every day. And I like when I reach the end of a book, I can close the book out. I can get a hold of some friends, climb in an airplane, fly out someplace, fly fishing for a week, and not have to answer to anybody. So that's the personal part. But the emotional part comes, for example, I just returned just in the last month from the largest writers and readers conference in the country called BoucherCon. It was in Nashville this year. It's absolutely remarkable experience to be standing having a conversation with another writer and have somebody just walk up and just ask to shake your hand and say, you know, I've got all of your books. Are you going to sit down sometime when you can autograph them for me? Or come in and say, you know, I thought I understood about thriller writing until I read your books, and yours are so different. And they are different. One of the things that's fundamentally different is I wore out on the superhero genre some time ago. I love, the superhero people that we now see in television and movies and so forth. But I'd reached the point where I could pick up a book about the same superhero, and by the 4th page, at least by the 4th chapter, I could tell you how it was going to end, who was going to get killed, the ending scenario. They become such a formula. So I like to write thrillers about common people who are faced with extraordinary circumstances, and they and their friends somehow get together and not only survive but thrive. So that's the fundamental difference. And to have somebody walk up and say, wow, that's really different. I really love that. It's a rush. It's a real rush.
That's awesome. These books, for folks listening in, I want to encourage folks to go and check out these books. These books seem like they would make great movies. Any thoughts or peek under the hood there? You got anything in the works or in the midst?
I have a book that I have been working with 2 or 3 people on. It's the book I wrote 12 years ago, and it is not a book that I can self-publish. It is way too close to home. It's a fictional book, but there's a lot of it that's biographical, semi-biographical, and a lot of it about not only myself, but other people who've had similar experiences to me. And I had the top literary agent from Great Britain look at the book about 4 or 5 years ago, and that was her comment. She said, this book would be better as a television show or as a movie. It would be extraordinary. We could never, ever get it done in Great Britain because one of the foundations of the book is domestic violence. And she said, we still sweep all that under the rug. But in America, you're beginning to talk about it. And that's the kind of thing that makes a really thrilling book right now. So for the first time in years, we're seriously working with some people to develop and publish that book. And there is some interest in doing I can't say movie or television because we're not far enough along, but a media description of the book.
Awesome. Well, congrats. What's some advice you give to maybe aspiring writers or maybe writers that do have writer's block? What's some advice you give? There's going to be folks listening to this podcast. You're going to have folks that are in college, 19, 20-year-old young adults that are maybe in some sort of writing classes. You're doing what they're aspiring to do. What's some advice you'd give them?
Well, I'm going to keep it very simple. There are 2 primary pieces of advice. First, read. Read everything you can. If you like fiction, read all kinds of fiction. Read all the genres that you can read for a while. Eventually, one of them will kind of settle into you and become something that you think you can do really well at. And the second thing is write. Just write. Write your first 4 books before you even think about trying to publish a book. Because the first book, you're going to look at it, you're going to take great pride in it, and you're going to think, wow, this is really good. Look at this accomplishment. And the bottom line is, it may be a very good story, but the craft is not going to be very good. But your second book, after you've given the first one a year to stew and had a few comments on it, the second book is going to be substantially better. And then by the time you get to the third book, you're beginning to really understand that the craft of writing, and the craft is, especially if you're writing thrillers, you have to keep the book moving page to page to page. You want the pages to turn quickly. I insert one other ingredient in that, though. I love it when somebody comes out and says, you know, I was ripping through your book. I was about 2/3 of the way through it, and then something came along and it forced me to stop and think about it. And I took a couple of days just to think about that. And then I came back and finished the book. I think you have to have something to write about that's of interest to people, that really gets their attention. And if you can do that, I think you've got a winner.
That's awesome. So, Rodger, tell me about your latest book that you've written, the newest one that's out, and maybe a little bit of a background behind the storyline.
Well, the latest book that's out is a precursor to a whole series. It's called Tempest North, and it's a story of really how the United States eventually came to acquire Alaska. And I don't write a lot about Alaska. There's a little of Alaska in every book that I write, but I don't consider myself just an Alaska writer. But the book is a story of one man who has been torn by events in his life, pulls himself together, captains a ship on his way to Alaska to do fur trading, and then go on to China. And how along the way he eventually finds himself again, and goes from being abusive and belligerent and overbearing to being a real human being. But most important, he learns that he doesn't have to do it all himself, that there are people that are willing to help him. He just has to let them. So that's that book. I have another book that was due out in about 2 weeks that I'd like to chat about. And
Yeah.
that one's called The Dragon, the Eagle, and the Jaguar. And it's a current events book. It is about Chinese meddling in the politics and economy of Mexico. And that book I have been working on for about 3 years. And it was due out on the 15th of October. The change in government in Mexico, which occurs tomorrow, caused several friends who had helped me do research on this book to call and say, let's sit on this for a couple of months and see what the new president has to say before we launch the book. But one of the things, you know, we talk about the border and how the border crisis and the number of people flowing across our border and fentanyl flowing across the border. An awful lot of people don't understand that much of that is being orchestrated not by Mexico and the Mexican cartels. They're pretty much controlled now by China. All of the fentanyl that goes into Mexico, that crosses our border, originates in China. Several years ago, the new president of Mexico, who leaves office today, authorized the charter of Chinese banks in Mexico, and they now launder all the cartel money. So they are very deeply involved in that whole drug trade, and then have a great deal of influence over what those cartels are doing in terms of moving people across the border. You know, 10 years ago, the people crossing the border were primary economic immigrants. I have a real problem if you look at it today, where, you know, 3 out of 4 people across the border are military-age young men. And they're not just from Mexico or Central America, they're from all over the world, with a very high percentage now from China. So that story, really, I won't get into the plot on it, but that story gets into, you know, how the Mexican government is slowly being pushed into a corner by China, and how their terror of being perceived by their own people as allowing the United States to dictate to them is keeping them from asking for help. Again,
and is that something that people can pre-order now, or is it going to be out on a specific date?
The pre-order, it is available right now on Amazon on pre-order and Barnes & Noble on pre-order. We had, again, expected it to be out right now, but I just have a hunch that there'll be a slight rewrite on that book coming about about the end of December. Well, I'm going to be in Mexico in December. Have an opportunity to chat with some of the people that have helped me with the book. And I think there'll probably just be a couple of chapters in there and get a minor rewrite. But I think the basic story will be there. But yes, the book is now available.
Nice. Well, for folks listening in, if I'm going to give away a couple of Rodger's books, email me, johnjohn@mustreadalaska.com. First couple people to email me, I'm going to send you a book or so, maybe a book or two of Rodger's. And so first people to email me, I'll do it for a couple folks. Email me, johnjohn@mustreadalaska.com. I'll send it over to you. Last question to you is this: how do folks learn more? Tell us about, are you on social media, your website? What's the easiest way to buy your books? Tell us all the details.
I'm on social media. My website is rodgercarlyle.com, RODGERCARLYLE.com. And I'm on Facebook. I do some Twitter. I have an extraordinary publicist who I work with, who basically manages all of that for me. I really love his work, primarily because it frees me up to write, which is my real passion here. And the business side of writing is something that, we've touched earlier on new writers. The business side is something that takes some time to learn, but first learn to write. If you have a really good book and you give it a little bit of exposure, what I found when I launched my first book and launched my first website is the people will find the book. The people will find the book, and once it starts selling, and once they start, you get word of mouth, and you get referrals, and you get reviews. Everything else just sort of works its way out.
That's awesome. Well, folks, I want to encourage you. I'm going to put all the links in the podcast description. Go check out Rodger's website. Go buy a book on Amazon. We're going to do that book giveaway. So the first couple people to email me, johnjohn@mustreadalaska.com, and to say I want that book, I will send you a couple books of Rodger's. I appreciate you coming on the Must Read Alaska show. You're welcome back anytime. You have any last minute thoughts here before we head off?
No, but it may be interesting to come back in December and chat about the changes in this new book. So maybe that would probably be early in January. So I'd love to do it. Right. Thank you very much. I really look forward to connecting with your followers, and I really appreciate the opportunity, John.
No problem. Well, I appreciate you coming on. For folks that listen, watch, and read Must Read Alaska, and you want to help keep the lights on, just go to mustreadalaska.com. On the right-hand side, there's a little donate button. Every $5, $10, $100 helps keep the lights on here at Must Read Alaska. If you want to sponsor the Must Read Alaska show, just email me, johnjohn@mustreadalaska.com. And folks, don't forget, if you want a free copy of one of Rodger's books, email me as well. The first couple of people to do that, I will send them a book. Until next time, I'm John Quick from somewhere in Alaska. Thanks so much for joining us, Rodger.